Our first speaker is Mark Henderson, and Mark's going to be giving a talk on voluntary mentoring, an other world journey. So good morning, Mark, and I'll turn off my camera now. Mark, would you like an indicator at a sort of a timing reference at 13 minutes, or are you okay with timing?
I'll be okay. I'll take 15, 20 minutes. Is that okay?
I think that's okay because one of the speakers has, has vacated the space for you. So good luck with your talk, and if you need anything, just shout out.
Great. Thanks so much, Richard. And good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Henderson, and I'm master's student, master's by research in the School of Arts and Social Sciences. And I've been looking at voluntary mentoring, and particularly voluntary adult male mentoring. I recognise that I'm not really covering the whole gamut in terms of gender, but it's just too big an area. So I'm doing what I can do, and I've been involved in this sort of area. So I'll just share my screen, if that's okay. Just give me a moment, please.
I'll let you know when we're seeing it, Mark. Yep, that's looking great.
Brilliant. Well, Guinea, which is welcome, and it's good to see you. I live, work, study and play on Gumbaynggirr land. It always was, and always will be Indigenous land. And I'm really grateful for that I live here. It's great. In my research, I'm supported by Professor Mark Hughes, Dr. Gregory Smith, and Professor John Hurley. They've been fantastic and really encouraging for me. I'm not someone who came through a typical academic journey to where I get to. I just had questions that I really needed answered. And I sort of kept banging on the university door until someone said, oh, you need to put in a proposal, and here I am 18 months later. So what I'm studying is adult voluntary male mentoring. And I'd like to go through over the next 15, 20 minutes, a little bit of detail about why it's voluntary male mentoring, a bit of a flash through the history of mentoring, where it came from. It's a really old idea and old concept. I'll go into the nuts and bolts of mentoring. There has been a fair bit of research done, particularly in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s. A lot of that was embedded within corporate America, and it really shines through in that regard. And then I'm going to look at some of the themes from the literature, particularly around voluntary mentoring, which is a bit different from some of the other academic or business or military type mentoring which has occurred in organisations and which has been researched a great deal. So the first thing is that voluntary male mentoring is occurring. Typically, there'll be two men, they'll meet up for about an hour a week. They'll be paired in some way. There are a few organisations doing this, and they offer this type of mentoring. What we're finding is that the mentee, often the younger man, they'll find it really relevant, and they really value it. They turn up, which is really important. The older man or the mentor generally finds it really meaningful. It gives more context to their life. And a typical thing they'll say is that they give something back. And often it opens up new worlds for everybody. And I'm going to talk about that a bit because it's part of the old idea. There's definitely engagement going on between two people, and typically belongings. People belong. In fact, they don't so much talk about it, they just belong. And people keep engaging with these organisations. So why voluntary? Well, there's this huge potential in the voluntary areas and services. Bit of feedback there. I don't know if someone needs to mute, but anyway, it's voluntary, which has the potential to engage loads and loads of people. Why men? Well, there was a problem, which I think a lot of people are aware of, and there's a lot of loneliness going on in our society, particularly around men. They're often socially disconnected. Often the men haven't really had permission to exercise skills or learn the skills which are needed to keep connected. There's some real fall-off points for men in our society. Often men will be involved in sport and their sporting club, and they literally do a knee. Something happens, they can't turn up and to that sport, and they lose connection. Big time. And there's been a major report called the 2014 Men's Social Connectedness Report, and it really identified the fall-off points for men. One is losing sport, often is the relationship breakdown. They find that their friends were more friends with their ex, and they're left on their own. And mentoring is the other key word in this, and it's acceptable. If I say to a man, go and do counselling, they go to one session. They don't do it. They're not interested. You immediately tell them they've got an issue and they can't handle it. It underlyingly doesn't work with their identity. But mentoring, that's a different concept. And it's acceptable and it's relatable. And this has been key to the sort of growth in this area and what's going on in it. So mentoring started way back. There was this writer. He was a superstar, but in his own little world. His name was Homer, a bit like the modern day Homer, who's obviously pretty well known. But this guy was around about 800 BC, and he was a playwright, a poet, and a dramatist. This is obviously before we had electronics, and the internet, and TV, and media, and everything. People used to gather and they'd have plays, and they'd be poems. And this guy wrote two really big ones. One was the Iliad, which you'd be familiar with. It's really the story of Troy. And the other one was the Odyssey, which was a little bit later, and it involved the king of Ithaca had gone off to the Trojan War and he hadn't returned. His name was Odysseus. And it followed his journey back and also his son's journey, Telemachus. And Telemachus was the prince. His father had gone away before, while he was still a young child. He was about 20, and he had a local. The house was falling into disrepair. There were all these suitors trying to get with his mother. His mother would sew this fabric, and then she'd unpick it apart.
Sorry, Mark. I'm not sure what's happening here. Craig, I can't control the participants. Can you do that as the host and perhaps mute? I think it's Dominic. Sorry, Mark, just excuse us for a moment.
Yeah, sorry, that's done, Matt.
Great, thank you. Carry on, Mark.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Richard. Yeah, so this superstar sort of playwright in his day, well, he may become famous later, he wrote this poem called the Odyssey. And what happens is the house is falling into disrepair. People are trying to get with the mother because they want to inherit the kingdom. The king's away. The young Telemachus, who's now about 20 years old, he, in many ways, is just the son of a king. And let's face it, if his mother gets with someone else, they'll probably top him. They're going to get rid of him. So a local sort of, a nearby tribesman, sort of a coastal tribesman of the chief, is visiting. He says, I knew your father, but he gets possessed by the god Athene. She's Zeus's daughter, actually. She's the most senior of the female gods and often associated with wisdom and war, I might add, but wisdom. And she possesses this guy called Mentes. And in that possession, she says, leave your childhood, go and seek your father. And the young Telemachus is filled with might and courage. And it talks about him entering this other world. And what that interpretation is it's sort of unknown to us in many ways because we live in a different society. We don't have a whole plethora of gods. we have psychology nowadays. They didn't. We would have had psychoanalysts nowadays, the idea of archetypes. They didn't. They just had a whole group of gods for which to describe and understand how they are in the world. Nonetheless, he enters this other world, and it seems to be one where he's now got purpose, and he's no longer a king's son. He's a young guy seeking his father. He's on a journey, and he quickly organises a crew and a ship, and he's been told, he knows to go down to Sparta and another town, because that was where the last people returning from the Trojan War came from, and they might know where his father is. But I won't get too much into it, but he faces a lot of challenges. But the character of mentor, known as Mentes, he doesn't play much of a big role. It's actually Athene, the god, who possesses different people along the way and gives him some advice. So that's part of it. Now, people used to study the Greek classics, but then we're going to jump right forward to 1699 in France. And there was a guy called Fenelon, and he had been a tutor to the second son of Louis XIII. And he got really quite disgusted and he did well for himself. He was really bright. He ended up the Bishop of Cambria, but he got really annoyed because the monarchy ruled with God-given right. So the idea is that God selects you because you get born as the firstborn son of the king. So you've been selected. So you're not going to make a mistake. You've been selected by God. It didn't go well. Two generations later, there was a guillotine of the royal family, and there was a French Revolution. But in this, Fenelon wanted to criticise the monarchy, and he rewrote this book by Homer, and he called it The Journey of Telemachus. And in this, the character mentor became much bigger character, and he keeps advising him. But the really interesting thing about this is that the prince, who the mentor is advising, the prince outranks the mentor. He's senior. It's his journey. And this is something we often lose, I think, in some of the mentoring literature which has been around, particularly around management literature, because the mentor is the senior person and is really in control and is making the selection. But in voluntary mentoring, the mentee makes the selection. It's the mentee's journey. It's up to the mentor to, in some ways, slow down and get into the mentee's life. And it's an interesting aspect which seems to be coming through. So there was other different slight works and different work around it. But then in 1978, there was quite a seminal book by a whole team of researchers in America. The lead person was Levinson, and it's called Seasons of a Man's Life. And in this, they interviewed 40 men. 10 were academics in the biology area, 10 were published authors, they had to have 2 books published, 10 were what you call blue-collar workers, and 10 were middle to senior management in either an engineering or an arms company in America. So there were 40 men. And in this book, Levinson really brought back the idea of mentoring. And they were looking for the structures in a man's life, but what they actually found is that there were development stages in a man's life similar to youth. A psychologist called Erickson has found similar type work. And the idea is that men go through different development stages. And during these stages, and they're age-based is the key around that. And during these different stages, they transition. And these transitions are quite important for sort of being complete, being full. And Levinson, being an academic, didn't go on, he just referred to it as mentoring and said, well, it's necessary. It's kind of a necessary thing that needs to happen. It gets you through these development stages, which is interesting, I find, because it seems to have some effect in it. So there's been a lot of research around mentoring. So the management studies really separated into categories, I should say, around career progression and psychosocial support. The career progression was written about extensively. The psychosocial support was always a bit wavy. mentoring dyads, which is a dyad is just a group, were assessed with regard to age, race, gender, meeting frequency and duration, any formal arrangement, location, and communication. What was found was that trust, respect, and listening skills and some purpose for the relationship was consistently identified as valuable to mentorship formation, with both the mentor and mentee perceiving benefits from the relationship. So what we've found and what the research shows so far, particularly in voluntary mentoring and the approach taken, the nuts and bolts of it if you want, is very much a Rogerian or humanistic psychology approach applied. The people doing it aren't counsellors, they're not psychologists, but they can take a very...
Who can respect other people's beliefs and opinions. We don't need people.
Not sure what that was, but so in terms of mentoring, the nuts and bolts of it, the Rogerian approach has unconditional positive regard. It's a bit like the regard of a parent towards their child. They're regarding them with a positive approach. Listening is key. Non-judgmental and non-directive. A lot of people get into mentoring and think, oh, I'm gonna sort this person out and give them advice and send them on their way. It doesn't work. It doesn't work with adult men anyway. They're adult men, Australian adult men, which I might add in my view, I look at Australian adult men and I actually view them as the most connected, resourced, networked, rich, travelled in many regards, connected people, connected men that have ever existed on planet Earth. They can be challenged, I'm sure, but we've got a lot going for us. And so to start telling another bloke what to do, it doesn't always work. But what you can do is you can listen. You can listen the heck out of someone. And it seems to unpack what's going on for them. So, which is a Rogerian approach, but the mentoring is really being embedded in this, in voluntary mentoring. There's a line which is often used, and we say that people do not care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that seems to be playing out quite strongly. So in terms of from the field, for the mentoring organisations, one of the CEOs for a group called Mentoring Men, and that's got 200 people trained now, and is also virtual. The CEO says, you've got to be able to do two things to be a mentor. You've got to be able to listen, you've got to be able to care. There's a group I'm involved with, and who I describe as the elder of the group. When I went to him and said, I'm about to deliver this this course to these guys, what's some last advice to you? Last advice that you can give me? He sort of didn't even look at my booklet or anything, and just said, Mark, you got to get this mentoring caper. It's simple, but it's not easy. So from the literature, what I found is there's four things in voluntary mentoring. And I looked at not only the literature, I looked at very much the volunteering. The first thing that happens in mentoring is there's a relationship. So often, if you're in counselling, it starts with an issue. If you're a coach, it starts with an outcome. If you're a teacher, it's about departing knowledge. But in mentoring, it just starts with the relationship. There's a journey involved. It doesn't always go forever. In fact, when you get to the sort of time that it's the end of a relationship in mentoring, it's often similar to a romantic breakup. Feelings get hurt, and it may be the mentor not feeling appreciated, the mentee is ready to move on. There's this other thing which is really important called mutuality. And often mutuality gets linked to a thing called reciprocity, but it's a bit different. So people think of themselves as members of the group rather than as just distinct individuals drawing from some shared interaction. It's not as transactional as reciprocity. It's mutuality. There's a shared feeling or action which goes on, which adds to the greater whole. And the last thing that goes on in this voluntary mentoring, in any mentoring really, is perspective. you get a different perspective. It's like two people harness themselves together, climb to the top of a mountain, and one of them's at the top and he's breathing so hard that he's not taking in. The other one's there going, oh, smell the air, it's so fresh. And the other one's looking down, being a bit terrified of the of how high they are. But the other bloke looks around and says, look at the view. They're both sharing a perspective, which has huge growth in it. So my research is going to involve interviewing the mentors, 12 voluntary male mentors. I feel it's a real privilege and looking forward to it. So I hope you enjoyed my trip through mentoring or voluntary male mentoring, and you may be able to draw from it. I'm keen to hear any questions.
Mark, thanks very much. That was a fascinating talk. And can I just apologise for the couple of interruptions that you had there? I don't know what those interruptions were really, but you recovered like an absolute pro and didn't skip a beat. So congratulations, well done. I could invite anybody to perhaps turn on cameras and unmute and ask any questions that you have for Mark. I've got a bunch here. I thought it was a fascinating talk, and I've written literally 10 questions down with a few anecdotes besides, but I won't hog the space. Please, anybody who has any questions, feel free to unmute, or you can put them in the Q&A section, and I'll be able to see them and ask Mark for you. So I've just got one comment here, just from Kay saying, great job, Mark, especially your ability to forge ahead during those interruptions. I totally agree. You've obviously done this plenty of times before, Mark, I think.
Yeah. So I was a facilitator. So I've presented at senior levels, things like that, and I got involved in a mentoring group, if you want, and then there was another group which then wanted to get into mentoring, and one of the older blokes basically tasked me with it and said, "Go and help these guys out," and sort of that I went from there. So, and that's where the questions came out from, because there was something happening which I wasn't quite getting, and here I am now. Yeah.
Kay's asked another question, perhaps, which I could just read to you here, Mark. Can you talk a little bit more about your ethics application and the process? Obviously, you're going to be interviewing people as part of your research. That would involve ethics clearance. Can you talk to that a little bit?
So very frustrating for me. So I, as I said, I didn't have a really background in universities, if you want. I did my undergraduate years ago and did a bit of study along the way. So I didn't really understand that there was this thing called an ethics application, quite frankly. I was ready to go ahead, and then suddenly I found this. I wanted to interview face-to-face, one-to-one. It was basically put to me that this is just too difficult now, especially that I'm interviewing a lot of old people. And I suppose the current climate as well, that, if suddenly a researcher spreads COVID and through a university, it would be a disastrous for funding. So everything's happening through Zoom. I was quite pleased. I was told by my supervisors that it never gets up. Don't worry about it, Mark. It will never get up first. I got up first term, so I didn't have to go through any amendments. I think I just was quite procedured with it. And I did, someone showed me this thing. I made this table, which I would recommend, where I identified all the risks in a table format, and how I was mitigating each risk, and made that really crystal clear. And then I took that table and then wrote it out in long form, but I did attach that table. So for someone who likes that sort of visual and structured form, I think that might have been beneficial for me, that they could see that I'd been very systematic about it. Oh, haven't got the video. Can't hear.
Sorry, Mark. Anna's posted a question here. She's interested in why your study is focused on Australian males and not necessarily males from a global perspective.
Sure. I wonder whether it will expand into a global perspective. I'm trying to grab hold of what I can handle, frankly. Yeah, I do wonder about how universal some of it might be, and I tend to think it is universal. I'm very much influenced by Heidegger and his idea of being and Dasein, that being part of being a human being. But there's the human aspect, which is where we're placed, where we're positioned. But I just thought that's what I could handle and that's what I could do, and better to make a contribution which is focused enough to be useful. I also, as I mentioned during the talk, I actually think Australian men are all over things in a lot of ways. There's some gaps, we don't express as much as some, but we express a whole lot more than some others. So there's also a big generation, there's a level of generational gap, which I've been exposed to. Yeah, I mean, the generations coming through. Yeah, so.
Well, I'm with you on Heidegger and his being in time and this concept of Dasein, and it's kind of mind-blowing stuff, but I'm doing that at the moment because I'm really looking at this sort of interaction between sort of human and thing and what it means to be. So, but it's kind of complicated stuff. I had a question. Your talk sort of spoke about mentoring both sort of 800 years before, the birth of Christ, and then in the 18th century, and now we're obviously in the 21st century. Mentoring as a concept may not have changed, but has the needs of the mentor or mentoree changed over that time, do you think? And has mentoring needed to respond to those changed needs over time?
Well, because it's really hard to know that. I sometimes think about the ancient Greeks, of course, which is where some of it came from. I think people have a need to connect, and we always have, whether it be an apprentice, an artisan in their workshop, Socrates, Plato, someone like that. So I also think our quest for satisfaction, or I mean, we talk about happiness now, and we look at that simple happiness of joy and, I don't know, beautiful people around us and pina coladas or something, or that more nuanced idea of flow, or we have the eudaimonic happiness, which is meaning. I actually really differentiate them out. Yeah. Yeah. And mentoring seems to be giving people meaning. And I think to be able to help someone else along in their journey is great. But it's really walking with that other person. There must be really deep cultural aspects. I wonder, because there are things, as I mentioned, in ancient Greece, they had a plethora of gods. They didn't have a unitary God. They didn't have an idea that God made man in his image. That wasn't the case. So, but they didn't have psychoanalysis. There were different backgrounds. But then I'd argue they probably did, but it was just done in a different way. So yeah, how do you cross cultures? How do you cross time? I'm not sure, but there seems to be that ability for people to connect with this idea consistently.
Yeah. I think you just touched on this, but Anna's just put in the chat section as well. Is mentoring influenced by culture? Do you see it sort of varying over different cultures?
I'm sure it varies. I mean, it varies by language. It varies by how we make meaning. I mean, a lot of what I should say a key aspect of this is that I didn't approach this from psychology. I approached it from sociology. I'm a sociologist. That's what is my interest, is how we make meaning. It's almost like we start at our skin and go out. And that's how my simple sort of bonehead type of description of sociology. And I think when we, how we make that meaning is obviously with words and the language we use. And hopefully, and a part of what I seek in this is to understand the themes and the language which is appropriate for modern day in our culture. In Australian culture, we might talk about being genuine or authentic. Something I've hit early is real. People talk about being real. and it came from some bikie friends, basically. You got to be real. And I said, oh, right, so it's the opposite of that being unreal. And they went, no, it's being a fake. And that was interesting, you know, that aspect of language. So,
yeah. Look, does anybody else have any more questions for Mark? Anna said, thank you. I'm not seeing any questions on the Wova app, but it's a tricky platform sometimes. So I'm hoping that I'm monitoring it okay, but I'm not seeing anything there. Perhaps I'll just leave with a final anecdote if I can, Mark. I think that I think this research is really relevant. It has a real opportunity to be applied. And I think for mentoring and for men particularly, the space might have been vacated a bit at the moment. That's sort of my sense of things. And the reason that I say that is a couple of years ago, I was a community lawyer and I used to pay a visit to a men's homeless shelter, effectively, for men in crisis situations. And one thing that always just astounded me was how quickly men could seem to go from a fairly stable home environment. There might have been some excessive drinking or some problems which caused a breakdown in the family relationship, separation from the partner and children perhaps, and how quickly a male could spiral from that home environment to literally living on the streets. Sometimes it could be as short a distance as a month or so, and the man was unrecognizable after a month from what he had been a month earlier. And it seemed that a big part of that was that there was very little opportunity for that man to make a connection, to vent, to communicate and to get support. So perhaps mentoring plays a part in that kind of context, I would think.
Yeah, that's so close to, I often talk about a man being held. You just hold a person to be held, and psycho-socially held, and that means a heck of a lot, because we do have our own answers, and we're the ones that have to take action, not you can't own someone else's action. They own it. So anyway, but I thank you. It's been a delight to present, and I hope people found that interesting.
We did, Mark. Thanks very much.